Julian stood under the crystal chandeliers of the $1.2 billion hotel I designed and announced his mistress was the upgrade his empire needed. He handed me divorce papers and thought he had discarded me like yesterday's trash. But while he was busy counting his assets, he forgot who actually owns the dirt beneath his precious skyscraper. He might have the building, but I can make the whole thing come crashing down whenever I want. My name is Elena Vance, and I stood in the periphery of the grand ballroom, clutching a crystal flute of champagne that tasted like ash in my mouth. This was the launch of the summit, the $1.2 billion hotel project that had consumed the last 5 years of my life. I knew every structural load, every hidden conduit, and every angle of light in this building because I was the one who designed it. I was the lead architect. Yet, as the spotlight swept across the room, they did not search for me. They focused entirely on the stage, where my husband, Julian Thorne, stood basking in the applause. Julian looked immaculate in his tuxedo, the very image of the modern American tycoon. He held the microphone with the ease of a man who believed he owned the world. He spoke of vision and grit, claiming the sleepless nights and the architectural breakthroughs as his own. Then, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, he gestured toward the front row. He pointed to Victoria, the blonde, poised daughter of Senator Sterling. He introduced her to the room as his muse. He told the press that her grace was the true inspiration behind the aesthetic of the summit. The room erupted in cheers, while I felt the air leave my lungs. Moments after the applause died down, Julian descended from the stage and gripped my elbow. His touch was firm, lacking any affection, as he steered me into the VIP holding room away from the prying eyes of the guests. The room was silent, insulated from the party outside. Julian did not hesitate. He pulled a thick envelope from his inner jacket pocket and tossed it onto the marble coffee table. It slid across the surface and stopped inches from my hand. I knew what it was before I even read the header. He looked at me with a terrifying calmness and told me that he needed an upgrade. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. He said that I was excellent at the technical side of things, but Victoria was the face the Thorne Empire needed now. He spoke of our marriage as if it were a business contract that had simply run its course. I stood there, frozen, as he confessed that he had been seeing Victoria for 8 months. For 8 months, while I was wearing a hard hat and fighting with contractors to ensure his legacy stood tall, he had been with her. He had been cheating on me in the very building I was constructing for him. The door clicked open, and Eleanor Thorne, his mother, walked in. She did not offer comfort. She looked at me with the same disdain she had held since the day Julian brought me home. She sneered at me, bringing up my past as an orphan, and told me I should be grateful. She said I should thank them for allowing me to use the Thorne name for 7 years. She made it sound like I was a stray dog they had graciously fed and were now putting back on the street. The final blow was administrative. Julian nodded to the head of security standing by the door. The guard, a man I had greeted every morning for the past 3 years, stepped forward and asked for my access badge. I handed it over, my fingers numb. They did not let me leave through the front door. 2 guards escorted me out through the service exit, marching me past the confused kitchen staff like I was a thief caught stealing silverware. I stumbled out onto the wet pavement of the rear loading dock. The rain was coming down hard, a cold, relentless downpour that soaked my evening gown in seconds. I shivered, hugging my arms around myself, and looked up. The summit towered above me, a glowing obelisk of glass and steel against the dark sky. Inside, the champagne was flowing and the music was playing. Outside, I was alone in the alley. My phone buzzed in my hand. I looked down at the screen through the rain. It was a message from Julian. He said the joint accounts had been frozen for auditing and told me not to try to contact him. I stared at the text, the cold rain mingling with the hot tears I refused to let fall, realizing he had planned this down to the last detail. The fall from the penthouse to the pavement was not just metaphorical. It was a physical, violent displacement that happened in the blink of an eye. Within 48 hours of being escorted out of the summit, my access to the penthouse on Fifth Avenue was revoked, and the locks were changed. When I tried to use my credit cards to book a hotel room, they were declined one by one. Julian had moved with the efficiency of a corporate raider, freezing our joint assets and launching a preemptive strike on my reputation. He planted stories in the industry tabloids claiming I was suffering from a nervous breakdown and had been stealing proprietary designs from junior architects. In the tight-knit world of New York architecture, I was suddenly radioactive. I had to pawn my engagement ring and a vintage watch my mother left me just to secure a deposit on a studio apartment in the South Bronx. It was a fourth-floor walk-up in a building that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp plaster. The silence of my old life, where triple-paned glass kept the city at bay, was gone. Now, my nights were filled with the screaming of police sirens, the rattle of the elevated train, and the constant thumping of bass from cars passing on the street below. I lay on a mattress on the floor, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, trying to understand how the lead architect of a $1.2 billion project had ended up here. I refused to give up at first. I sent out resumes to every firm in the city, from the prestigious giants to the small boutique studios. The rejection letters came back with humiliating speed. Most were standard template refusals, but some were personal. Former colleagues, people I had shared coffee with for years, told me they could not take the risk. The influence of the Thorne family, combined with the political reach of Senator Sterling, had created a wall around me. No one was willing to hire the crazy ex-wife of Julian Thorne. I was not just unemployed, I was unemployable. Hunger has a way of eroding pride. When the cash from the pawn shop started to run out, I took the only job I could find that did not require a background check. I became a part-time housekeeper at a budget motel chain near the airport. It was a cash job, strictly off the books, paying minimum wage. The uniform was a shapeless blue tunic that smelled of industrial detergent. The humiliation was a physical weight I carried from room to room. I spent my days scrubbing toilets and stripping sheets stained with the filth of strangers. My hands, which had spent a decade sketching delicate structural arches and handling fine drafting paper, were now red, chapped, and peeling from the harsh chemicals. I was cleaning up the cheap, sordid debris of other people's lives while the building I had poured my soul into stood shining across the river. I would scrub the grout in a bathroom and remember the Italian marble I had selected for the summit, feeling a bitter laugh bubbling up in my throat. One afternoon, I was taking my lunch break in the cramped supply closet when I saw a discarded newspaper on a folding chair. The headline seemed to mock me. It announced the upcoming wedding of the century. Julian and Victoria were to be married at the summit in 2 weeks. The article gushed about the romantic setting and described the grand ballroom as a masterpiece of modern design. They were going to celebrate their union on the very floors I had designed, under the lights I had positioned. I felt a wave of nausea and threw the paper into the trash bin. That night, the radiator in my apartment died, leaving the room freezing. I was rummaging through the single duffel bag I had managed to salvage, looking for an extra pair of socks, when my fingers brushed against something hard and smooth. It was a small, polished oak box. I pulled it out. It had belonged to Arthur Thorne, Julian's grandfather. He had been a ruthless businessman, but he was the only member of the Thorne family who had ever treated me with respect. I sat on the cold floor, holding the box. I remembered the day Arthur gave it to me, exactly 2 years before he passed away. We were in his library, and the air smelled of old paper and cigar smoke. He had slid the box across his mahogany desk to me, ignoring Julian, who was standing right there. He looked me in the eye and told me that I was the only one in the family with true vision. He said to keep the box safe and to only open it on a rainy day. I looked at the rain lashing against my single-pane window and realized the storm he had predicted had finally arrived. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the cold seeping through the thin rug, and pried open the lid of the oak box. I expected perhaps a letter of encouragement or a piece of antique jewelry. Instead, I found a single, weathered manila folder labeled Ground Zero Holdings. My memory flashed back to my 26th birthday. a small family dinner where Arthur had slid this very folder across the table to me. Julian had scoffed at the time, joking that his grandfather was giving me a shell company with zero assets just to teach me about tax liabilities. I had filed it away in the box and forgotten about it, assuming it was just one of Arthur's eccentric lessons in corporate management. But desperation breeds curiosity. The next morning, I took the train to a rundown office building in Queens to find Saul, the name stamped on the legal documents inside the folder. Saul was a relic of a bygone era, a retired attorney who had been Arthur's drinking buddy and confidant long before the Thorne family became royalty. His office smelled of stale coffee and old law books, a stark contrast to the glass-walled legal departments I was used to. He squinted at me through thick spectacles as I laid the folder on his cluttered desk. Saul opened the file, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned the pages. Then, a slow, dry chuckle escaped his lips. He looked up at me and told me that Ground Zero Holdings was not empty. He explained that it was a holding company created for a singular, specific purpose. It held the perpetual land lease for the city block located at the intersection of 5th and Main. My breath caught in my throat. That was the address of the summit. Saul leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of a buried secret coming to light. He explained that when Arthur acquired the site 30 years ago, he had separated the land ownership from the development rights to protect the asset from potential bankruptcy suits. The land belonged to Ground Zero Holdings. The building belonged to Thorne Development. The Thorne family, in their arrogance and haste to modernize the empire after Arthur died, had made a catastrophic error. They assumed they owned everything. In the complex transfer of power, the renewal of the land lease between the parent company and the subsidiary had slipped through the cracks. They had forgotten to pay the rent or renew the contract with the company that Arthur had quietly transferred to my name. Saul turned the document around and pointed to a date at the bottom of the page. The lease was set to expire on October 14th. I stared at the date, feeling a chill run down my spine. October 14th was 3 days ago. It was the exact day Julian had pulled me into the VIP room and demanded a divorce. It was the day he claimed he was upgrading his life. The terms were brutal and absolute. The contract stated that if the lease expired without renewal, the landowner had the immediate right to reclaim the premises. More importantly, it contained a reversion clause. It said that the landowner could demand the tenant remove any improvements made to the land at the tenant's expense, or else those improvements would become the property of the landowner. I did the math in my head. The land itself was valued at roughly $47 million. That was a fortune to me now, but it was nothing compared to the leverage I held. The summit, the steel and glass tower Julian had built to stroke his ego, had cost $1.2 billion, and it was sitting on my dirt. Without a lease, his skyscraper was technically a trespassing structure. I looked at Saul, and for the first time in weeks, the crushing weight on my chest vanished. I was no longer the discarded wife or the unemployed architect. I was the landlord. A plan began to form in my mind, not one of screaming matches or public scenes, but a cold, calculated dismantling of Julian's world using the very laws he thought protected him. I thanked Saul and walked out of that dusty office, stepping into the sunlight with the realization that I didn't need to break down the doors of the summit to get back in. I owned the ground they stood on. I walked back into the summit 2 days later, but not through the front doors made of tempered glass that I had specially ordered from Germany. I entered through the service bay, wearing an oversized gray uniform that rendered me invisible to the people who used to answer to me. I was technically trespassing on the property of Thorne Development, but legally, I was just walking on my own land. The irony was a bitter pill that I savored as I pushed my cleaning cart across the polished lobby floors. From behind a potted palm, I watched Victoria directing a team of exhausted contractors. She was standing in the center of the atrium, pointing a manicured finger at a massive structural column that supported the mezzanine level. She was demanding that they shave down the width of the pillar because it blocked the natural light for her upcoming photo shoot. I listened as the foreman tried to explain that the column was load-bearing, but Victoria waved her hand dismissively and told him that aesthetics were the priority. She was literally chipping away at the foundation of the building to suit her vanity, completely unaware that she was compromising the safety of everyone inside. I took the service elevator up to the 40th floor, the level designated for the ultra-luxury suites. This was where Julian had supposedly spent the bulk of the budget, but as I ran my hand along the wall panels, I felt the difference immediately. The specifications called for solid walnut, but under my fingertips, I felt the cheap, smooth texture of laminate veneer. I checked the bathroom fixtures. They looked like gold, but they were lightweight plated brass. Julian was cannibalizing the construction budget. He was installing budget materials in the high-end suites and pocketing the difference, likely to fund the extravagant wedding that was splashing across every magazine cover in the city. The building was a hollow shell, a perfect metaphor for the man who owned it. In the hallway, I nearly collided with Marcus, one of the senior mechanical engineers I had hired years ago. He looked 10 years older, his eyes rimmed with red. He didn't recognize me at first in my uniform, but when I whispered his name, he nearly dropped his clipboard. We ducked into a linen closet, and he spilled everything. He told me that Julian had forced them to bypass the advanced waste treatment system I had designed. Instead, the hotel was dumping untreated chemical runoff directly into the city sewage line, a violation that could result in fines massive enough to bankrupt the project. Julian had cut the environmental safety protocols to save $300,000, a sum he probably spent on Victoria's engagement ring. The first strike from my side came the next morning. Saul sent a formal legal document via courier directly to the executive offices. It was a standard notice of trespassing and a demand to vacate the premises due to an expired land lease. I was cleaning the glass partitions of the conference room when the courier arrived. Through the clear wall, I saw Julian pick up the envelope. He glanced at the return address, saw the name Ground Zero Holdings, and laughed. He showed it to his mother, Eleanor, who was sipping coffee on the leather sofa. She didn't even look at the paper. She just waved her hand as if swatting away a fly. They thought it was a prank or a scam from a shell company. Julian crumpled the notice into a ball and tossed it into the recycling bin without even reading the terms. They were so blinded by their own importance that they didn't bother to check who actually held the keys to their kingdom. I retrieved the crumpled paper later, smoothing it out on my lap. Their arrogance was their greatest weakness. I could have pushed harder then. I could have called the police or marched into his office with the deed, but that would have been too easy. I wanted the collapse to be total. I wanted it to happen when the world was watching. The televised engagement party was scheduled for Saturday night. That was the stage Julian had built for his triumph. So I decided that was where I would orchestrate his fall. The countdown to the engagement party hit the 7-day mark, and that was when I decided to stop being a ghost and start being a guillotine. Saul did not send a polite letter this time. He sent a process server accompanied by a court officer to deliver a temporary restraining order regarding the use of the land situated at the coordinates of the main lobby. The injunction was specific and devastating. It claimed that the tenant was operating a commercial enterprise on private land without a valid lease, effectively legally sealing off the grand entrance of the summit. Panic must have spread through the executive suite like a virus. I imagined the frantic shouting as Julian screamed at his legal team to fix it. It took them less than an hour to finally pull the incorporation papers for Ground Zero Holdings. I was not there to see it, but I knew the exact moment they realized the truth. My phone, which had been silent for 3 months aside from debt collectors, lit up with Julian's private number. I let it ring until the final second before answering. Julian did not start with a hello. He launched into a tirade, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He demanded to know if this was some kind of sick joke. When I remained silent, his bluster evaporated, replaced by a terrified desperation I had never heard from him before. He asked to meet. He begged to meet. I told him to come to a diner in the South Bronx, a place with sticky laminate tables and the smell of burnt bacon hanging in the air. I wanted him to step out of his ivory tower and into the reality he had forced me into. He arrived 20 minutes later, looking absurdly out of place. He was wearing a charcoal Italian suit that cost more than the annual rent of everyone else in the restaurant combined. He looked around nervously, as if he expected to be mugged, before sliding into the booth opposite me. He did not ask how I was. He did not ask where I was living. He simply reached into his jacket and pulled out a cashier's check. He slid it across the greasy table. I looked down. It was made out for $5 million. Julian leaned in, his eyes darting around the room. He told me that $5 million was more money than I had ever seen in my life. He said I could take it, sign the lease renewal, and disappear. He told me to go to Europe or buy a house on the coast, as long as I stayed away from his hotel. I looked at the check, then up at him. I told him that he was the one who said he needed an upgrade. I slid the check back to him. I said that I had decided to upgrade the price. The price was no longer money. The price was control. Julian turned pale. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time. He lowered his voice to a hiss. He admitted that Senator Sterling was putting immense pressure on him. He said that if there was even a whisper of a legal dispute regarding the property, the wedding would be called off. The senator could not afford a scandal during an election year. If the hotel went down, Julian would lose the marriage, the political backing, and his position as CEO. I leaned back, crossing my arms. I told him I did not care about his marriage or his father-in-law. I told him that my condition for signing any lease was a full, public forensic audit of the entire construction project. I wanted an independent firm to check every invoice, every material specification, and every safety protocol. The color drained from his face completely. He knew exactly what an audit would find. It would find the cheap laminate, the plated brass, and the illegal waste dumping. It would send him to prison. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The desperation was gone, replaced by a cold, venomous anger. He grabbed the check and shoved it back into his pocket. He leaned down and whispered that I was making a mistake. He threatened to use the senator's connections to bury me. He said he would find a way to invalidate the deed and crush me under legal fees until I starved. He stormed out of the diner, leaving me with the smell of his expensive cologne mixing with the scent of old coffee, signaling that the real war had just begun. The retaliation from the Thorne dynasty was swift, brutal, and coordinated. The very next morning, the manager at the motel intercepted me before I could even clock in. He refused to look me in the eye as he told me I was fired effective immediately due to an anonymous tip claiming I was stealing from guests. An hour later, I returned to my studio apartment to find my key no longer worked. The landlord was waiting for me with two large men, claiming that my tenancy had been revoked for security reasons. I stood on the sidewalk with my duffel bag, knowing exactly whose hand was pulling these strings. Julian was trying to starve me out, to strip away the meager existence I had built so I would have no choice but to crawl back to him and beg. Then came the call from Saul. He sounded breathless, speaking from a payphone 3 blocks from his office. He told me that agents from the Internal Revenue Service had raided his practice that morning, citing a random audit. They were seizing boxes of files and freezing his operational accounts. Julian was scorching the earth, using his political connections to destroy anyone who dared to help me. He thought that by destroying the paper trail, he could destroy my claim. But he had underestimated the paranoia of a woman who had lived in his shadow for 5 years. I had anticipated this move the moment I found the box. Weeks ago, I had made digital copies of every original blueprint, every structural load report, and every fraudulent invoice Julian had signed. I had the evidence of him swapping high-grade steel for cheap imports and pocketing the difference. I was not defenseless. I was armed with terabytes of proof. I needed a heavy hitter, so I walked into the headquarters of Sterling Construction. It was a bitter irony that Julian's fiercest rival in the city shared a surname with his new fiancée, though there was absolutely no relation between the construction firm and the senator's family. I met with the vice president of acquisitions and laid my cards on the table. I offered them a future option on the land lease. If they helped me weather this legal storm, I promised to sell them the rights to the ground beneath the summit once I reclaimed it. They agreed to shield me, sensing an opportunity to bury their competitor once and for all. That evening, Victoria made her move. She tracked me down to a small coffee shop where I was waiting for a call from my new allies. She swept in wearing a coat that cost more than my college tuition, looking entirely out of place among the tired commuters. She sat down without asking and slid a thick envelope across the table. She sneered at me, calling me a desperate gold digger who was trying to sabotage her happiness because I could not keep a man. She told me to take the cash and disappear before I got hurt. I stayed silent, my hand resting casually near my purse, where my phone was recording every word. Victoria mistook my silence for hesitation and pressed harder. In her arrogance, she let the mask slip. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, and told me that I had no idea who I was messing with. She admitted that the summit was not just a hotel. She revealed that the construction budget was being used to funnel illegal campaign contributions for her father, Senator Sterling. She explicitly said that Julian had to open the hotel to wash the money before the election cycle closed. The hotel affair was not just about sex, it was about laundering millions of dollars in political bribes. I waited until she finished her tirade and stormed out, confident she had intimidated me. I stopped the recording and saved the file to 3 different cloud servers. Then, I attached the audio file to a message and sent it to Julian. I typed a simple caption. I told him that I no longer just held the land beneath his feet. I held the keys to his prison cell. The audio file I sent to Julian acted like a grenade thrown into a sealed room. The explosion was contained, but the damage was catastrophic. Julian was suddenly trapped in a vice grip between my legal threats and the terrified rage of his new family. My sources told me that Senator Sterling had threatened to bury Julian under the jail if a single word of the money laundering scheme reached the public. The senator made it clear that Julian was expendable. If the scandal broke, the senator would claim total ignorance and point the finger squarely at his son-in-law. Julian was no longer fighting for his hotel. He was fighting to stay out of federal prison. That immense pressure forced the rats out of the woodwork. Eleanor Thorne, the woman who had looked at me with pure disdain for 7 years, tracked me down to the small office Sterling Construction had lent me. She did not sneer this time. She looked aged and frail. She sat on the edge of the chair, clutching her pearls, and played the only card she had left. She spoke about family. She reminded me of the holiday dinners and the years we had lived under the same roof. She asked me how I could be so cruel to the people who had taken me in when I was an orphan. She begged me to think of the family honor. I listened to her entire speech without blinking. When she finished, I leaned forward and repeated the exact words she had spat at me on the night of the launch. I told her that I was just a person who was allowed to use the Thorne name for a while. I said that since I was just a user, I owed them absolutely nothing. I told her that the family honor she spoke of was bought with stolen money and lies. I watched the hope die in her eyes as I asked security to show her the door. I felt no guilt, only the cold satisfaction of justice. With his mother failing and his father-in-law threatening him, Julian made a fatal error born of pure panic. He tried to rewrite history. He suddenly produced a lost document, a lease renewal allegedly signed by his grandfather, Arthur Thorne, just days before his death. Julian claimed he had found it in a forgotten safe deposit box. It was a clumsy, amateurish attempt to save his empire. He did not know that Saul and I had already prepared for this exact scenario. We had a forensic handwriting analysis of Arthur's signature on file, authenticated and notarized weeks ago. When Julian presented his forged document to the court to try and block my injunction, he did not just lose the argument, he committed a felony. We immediately filed a motion proving the signature was a modern fabrication using ink that did not even exist when Arthur was alive. Now, Julian was not just facing civil bankruptcy, he was looking at criminal charges for fraud and forgery. The smell of blood in the water alerted the sharks. Victoria realized that the ship was sinking fast. The muse of the summit decided she did not want to go down with the captain. My contacts at the local tabloids tipped me off that she was quietly shopping around an exclusive interview. She was planning to frame herself as the innocent victim. A young, naive woman deceived by a manipulative tycoon. She was ready to throw Julian to the wolves to save her own reputation and her father's political career. The alliance that Julian had destroyed our marriage for was tearing itself apart. I watched from the shadows as husband and wife turned on each other. Julian was screaming at Victoria for disloyalty, and Victoria was leaking damaging stories about Julian's temper to the press. It was a spectacle of greed eating itself. They were so busy fighting each other that they did not see the final blow coming. I sat in my temporary office, watching the chaos unfold on the news monitors. The grand reopening party was still scheduled for the weekend, a desperate attempt by Julian to pretend everything was normal. That was perfect. I did not want to stop the party. I wanted to attend it. The night of the engagement party arrived, transforming the summit into a fortress of light and excess. The guest list was a roll call of the city's elite, from tech billionaires to media moguls, all eager to witness the union of the Thorne and Sterling dynasties. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed like accusations at the gleaming tower. Inside, champagne flowed freely, and a string quartet played soft classical music, masking the rot beneath the surface. Julian stood at the center of it all, smiling for the cameras, desperate to maintain the illusion of control. I did not arrive in a limousine. I arrived in a convoy of government vehicles. I stepped out of the lead car, flanked not by a date, but by the chief of police and the head of the city building inspection department. We marched past the stunned valet attendants and through the double doors I had designed 5 years ago. The music stopped abruptly as the sight of uniformed officers entering the ballroom sent a ripple of confusion through the crowd. I walked straight to the center of the room, my voice calm but amplified by the silence. I announced that I was activating an emergency clause under the city's building code. I declared the building unsafe for occupancy due to critical structural violations and unauthorized construction on private land. I held up the official order signed by a judge less than an hour ago. The Department of Buildings inspector stepped forward and formally announced that the certificate of occupancy was revoked effective immediately. Panic set in instantly. The wealthy guests, realizing this was not part of the entertainment, began to scramble for the exits. Julian pushed his way through the crowd, his face twisted in fury. He screamed at the police to arrest me for trespassing. He tried to grab the microphone, but I was faster. I handed a thick file to the chief of police in full view of the rolling cameras. It contained the evidence of the forged lease, the environmental violations, and the money laundering trail leading back to the senator's campaign fund. The flashing lights of the press cameras turned the scene into a chaotic strobe light show. Every reporter in the room was now live streaming the collapse of the Thorne Empire. Julian froze as the chief of police began to read him his rights. Then came the final betrayal. Victoria, realizing the cameras were rolling, seized her moment. She stepped onto the small podium, tears already streaming down her face. She loudly proclaimed that she had been deceived by a monster. She pulled the massive diamond ring from her finger and threw it at Julian. It bounced off his chest and clattered onto the marble floor. She declared the engagement over, framing herself as the heartbroken victim of a criminal mastermind. Almost simultaneously, a spokesperson for Senator Sterling released a statement to the press outside. The senator denied any knowledge of the financial irregularities and expressed his shock and disappointment in Julian Thorne. He threw Julian under the bus with political precision, severing all ties to save his own career. The last image the world saw that night was not of a triumphant CEO. It was of Julian Thorne, his tuxedo rumpled, his hands cuffed behind his back, being led away by 2 officers. He looked back at me one last time, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and defeat. I stood motionless in the center of the emptying ballroom, the true owner of the ground beneath his feet, watching as his house of cards finally fell. The collapse of Thorne Development was absolute. In the week following the arrest, the stock price did not just dip, it evaporated. The market reacted to the revelations of fraud and money laundering with a ruthless efficiency. Investors fled in droves, leaving the once mighty corporation as a hollow shell of debt and scandal. The banks moved in like vultures to pick the carcass clean. They seized Julian's penthouse, his fleet of luxury cars, and even Eleanor's beloved estate in the Hamptons. The assets they had flaunted to humiliate me were stripped away, piece by piece, to pay off creditors who had been lied to for years. The legal battle ended as quickly as it had begun. The court ruling was decisive. The judge affirmed that Ground Zero Holdings, and by extension, I, held the indisputable rights to the land. The summit was legally a trespassing structure. The bank that held the mortgage on the building found themselves in a nightmare scenario. They owned a $1.2 billion building that they had no right to keep on the land, and they certainly could not move it. They were desperate to salvage anything from the wreckage. I did not demand the demolition of the tower. That would have been a waste of resources and effort. Instead, I made the bank an offer. Since the building was a liability on my property, I offered to purchase the structure for a fraction of its construction cost. It was a ruthless lowball offer, cents on the dollar, but they had no leverage. They accepted. In a single signature, I acquired a billion-dollar asset for the price of a modest office building. The first order of business was to erase the name Thorne from the skyline. I sent crews up the side of the building to dismantle the massive illuminated letters that spelled out the summit. In their place, I commissioned a new sign, modest but elegant. I renamed the hotel the Arthur. It was a tribute to the only man in that family who had possessed a soul, the man whose foresight had given me the weapon to reclaim my dignity. Then came the internal purge. I walked into the executive boardroom, the same room where I had been ignored for years, and fired the entire upper management team. I dismissed every sycophant who had enabled Julian's corruption, but I did not empty the building. I called a town hall meeting in the ballroom for the housekeeping staff, the kitchen porters, and the maintenance crew. I saw the fear in their eyes. They looked at me and saw a boss, expecting to be discarded just as I had been. I stood on the stage and told them that I knew exactly how heavy their carts were and how much their backs ached after a double shift. I told them that under my leadership, they were no longer invisible. I retained every single service worker and immediately instituted a 20% raise across the board, along with full health benefits. The room went silent, then erupted in tears and applause. I was not just building a hotel, I was building a community. I spent the next 6 months wearing a hard hat and steel-toed boots. I personally oversaw the renovations. We ripped out the cheap laminate Julian had installed in the penthouses and replaced it with the solid walnut originally specified. I brought in environmental crews to fix the waste disposal systems, bringing the building up to code. I reinforced the structural columns that Victoria had tried to weaken for her vanity. I turned the building into what it was always meant to be, a masterpiece of safety and design. Sometimes, when I was leaving the site late at night, I would see a figure standing on the opposite street corner. It was Julian. He was out on bail, awaiting a trial that would almost certainly end in a prison sentence. He looked thinner, his hair graying and unkempt, wearing a coat that looked 2 sizes too big. He was bankrupt, disowned by his family, and abandoned by his high society friends. He would stand there in the cold, looking up at the warm lights of the Arthur, watching the woman he had discarded rebuild the empire he had destroyed. I never waved. I never acknowledged him. I just got into my car and drove home, leaving him in the past where he belonged. The grand atrium of the Arthur was filled with a warm, respectful silence, a stark contrast to the hollow noise of the party where my life had fallen apart months ago. I stood at the podium, not as a decorative wife, but as the owner and CEO. The flashbulbs went off, but this time they were focused on the oversized check I was holding. I was announcing the launch of the Arthur Thorne Foundation, a scholarship fund dedicated to supporting young, underprivileged architects who had the vision but lacked the means. It was the legacy Arthur had always wanted, and I was finally in a position to build it. As the applause died down and I stepped off the stage, a disturbance near the entrance caught my eye. A man was trying to push past the velvet ropes, arguing loudly with the press. It was Julian. He looked like a ghost of the man who had once commanded this room. His suit was wrinkled and ill-fitting, his face gaunt and unshaven. He spotted me and lunged forward, his eyes wild with a mixture of desperation and delusion. He reached out, his fingers grasping at the air between us. He started babbling about our 10 years together. He reminded me of our history, claiming that we were a team and that he had made a mistake. He begged for a second chance, or at least a loan to help him with his legal fees. He looked at me expecting the woman who used to fold his laundry and manage his moods to reappear. I looked at him, and I realized with a sudden clarity that my anger was gone. It had been replaced by a profound, cold pity. I did not raise my voice. I simply waited for him to stop talking. When he finally fell silent, panting for breath, I delivered the final line of our marriage. I told him that he had said he needed an upgrade. I gestured to the hotel around us, then to myself, and finally to the security guard stepping in behind him. I told him that this was my upgrade. My upgrade was a life that did not include him. I nodded to the head of security. It was the same man who had escorted me out into the rain on that humiliating night. He did not hesitate. He stepped forward, placed a firm hand on Julian's shoulder, and informed him that he was trespassing on private property. He addressed me as Chairman Vance as he asked if I wanted the police involved. I shook my head and simply told him to remove the disturbance. Julian was dragged out, shouting my name, but the heavy glass doors closed, silencing him for good. I took the private elevator up to the penthouse. I had gutted the space completely. The bachelor pad aesthetic was gone, replaced by a sleek, functional office filled with natural light and drafting tables. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a news alert. The anonymous tip I had sent to the press regarding Victoria had gone viral. The screenshots of her text messages, where she explicitly discussed laundering campaign funds through the hotel construction, were now public knowledge. Her frantic attempts to play the victim had crumbled. The Sterling political dynasty was effectively over. I walked over to the massive oak desk that dominated the room. A contract was waiting for my signature. It was a partnership agreement with a major development firm in Tokyo, eager to collaborate with Elena Vance. They did not care who my husband was. They wanted my mind, my designs, and my reputation. I signed my name with a flourish, cementing my status as an independent power in the architectural world. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city skyline. I poured myself a glass of vintage red wine and sat back in my leather chair. My eyes fell on the simple oak box sitting on the corner of the desk. I ran my fingers over the wood. There was no tearful forgiveness, no sentimental longing for the past. There was only the quiet, steady rhythm of a heart that had been broken and rebuilt stronger than before. I raised my glass to the box, to Arthur, and to myself. I had won, not by playing dirty, but by playing smart. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on Elena's revenge. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach even more people.